Welcome back. This is week one, lecture two, with the title. I'll have to look at the title again. The Reformation, and the Transformation of Christendom. This lecture, and that's maybe even why I stuttered at first, is a difficult one for me to give. I'm not talking about the difficulty of the material as such, but the difficulty that I have, because essentially this is covering material that I usually treat in three different courses, and trying to do so all in one, and then maybe partly in the next week's first lecture as well, or first second lecture next week as well. So that makes it difficult for me because it's also my area of expertise and my area of research. And so I have to somehow um, figure out what to leave out and what to skip, which pains me because for me, this is also exciting. And to simply give in very, very, very broad strokes, it's like I have the feeling that the students aren't going to understand any of this unless we really get into the nitty gritty of it all, which then would necessitate you taking my late and or high and late medieval course, even my early medieval course, and then my Reformation course. But I'm not going to do that. So this is going to be fast and furious. I will try to be aware of the time and not allow myself to run off, even though that's going to be very difficult, but I'll try on issues. But it's needed because if we're talking about early modern Europe and then modern Europe, which is what this course covers, the question is, and I addressed this somewhat in last lecture, where do we begin? And there's really not a good point to begin. How do we start? And if we're looking at the emergence of early modern Europe, what did it emerge from? And can we understand the emergence and development of early modern Europe if we don't understand, to some extent, what it emerged from? Now, that's the dilemma we have, because we could say the same thing at any given point that we might choose to start. So it's an inherent problem in history. Where to start, where to end, and why, and on what basis. And any starting point or ending point is going to be artificial to some extent. There are reasons. 1648, as I mentioned and talked about last lecture, is where the textbook starts, and that's with the end of the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia. And that's a very good point to start at. But then why? And don't we have to go back and look at what came before to understand what is going to be developing from 1648 and thereafter? And I would say absolutely. That's what this lecture and then next week's lectures are attempted to cover in a very brief period of time. As I said, kind of like 3 or 4 courses all tucked into now, I guess, 3 lectures. So bear with me. And if you have any questions, please just shoot me an email and ask, either of really needing to understand. I don't really understand why you said what you said about that and what does that really mean, to I thought that was really interesting. Can you tell me more about it? So anything is open, please. So given that, now, with that construct, what did early modern Europe emerge from? And the answer to that is Christendom. Now, Christendom is a difficult concept. I'll be talking about that more in a minute. And it's basically a myth. Now, if you look at the PowerPoint slides, you'll see I talk about from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state in the last slide, I believe it is. And in some ways, the development of medieval and early modern Europe, as I portray it in my courses, is the transitions from the myth of Rome to the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. And then the question is, what is the new myth? Is there a new myth? And we'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about that in later lectures. And also at the end, where are we headed? Now, the term myth is problematic too, because so often colloquial, see, I can't even talk, colloquial use of the term, sorry for that. The colloquial use of the term myth is contrasted with reality or truth. Myth is like that, which is false. That's just a myth. That's not how I use the term. There's a whole study, academic study of myths, mythology. And it is looking at understandings. And as I use the term myth, a myth contains, and let's say a myth with a capital M rather than a lowercase m, myth contains truth, just not literal scientific truth. But there's some experience there that can't be grasped if we look at it simply on the surface level, on the apparent level, on the literal level, on the scientific level. There's something more to that. If you are questioning what I'm saying about this, just as a little indication, what is love? What is love? If you love someone, you say, oh, I love that person. And erotic sexual love, what is that? We could say that's just a biological development to procreate. Evolutionary development. Because if it wasn't enjoyable, if it wasn't something that we wanted to do, would we? Why? If it was painful and problematic, and then what would happen to the species? So love, what we call love, is just adding on all of these mythological dynamics to a biological process. Now, you can accept it that way if you would like. I think most people would find that not so satisfying. And then, the symbol of love is the red rose. Now, the red rose we could describe in botanical scientific terms, but do those really capture what the red rose is? Is an issue of meaning and understanding and symbolism. That's the realm of myth. And that's what I'm meaning by myth. We talk about these myths of Rome, myths of Christendom, and the myth of the nation state. These are overarching understandings that if we had to look at what is the reality, they're not quote unquote real, at least the historian can tell, but that they had a real effect and impact on how people understood their world, themselves, and served as the basis of action. And we'll see that, I think, increasingly as we go along. So that's what we're looking at. The development from the myth of Rome, which I'll talk about very briefly, to the myth of Christendom, which I'll talk about briefly too, and then spend more time on the myth of the nation state. If we don't understand the emergence of the myth of the nation state from the myth of Christendom, we're not really going to understand what was different about the myth of the nation state. So that being said, that's kind of the context, I hope. Then we can delve right in, and again, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but without just being incoherent, I hope. And so we begin with Christendom. Now I have up here on the slide Christendom, the definition. Christendom is a religio-political entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. Now that is a definition that historians have come up with. And what it really entails is that in the Middle Ages, when we see the Latin term Christianitas, we really shouldn't translate it as Christianity. I mean, Christianity is a viable, adequate translation of Christianitas. But in this context, it really means Christendom. And Christendom even is a word that we still hear every now and then. Christendom, not all of Christendom, which simply means anywhere and everywhere that Christianity is practiced. That's not what the myth of Christendom was for the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it was really a geopolitical entity. And what it was seen as was the Christian Empire. Beginning with Charlemagne, the court of Charlemagne, we have first references to the Christian Empire and the Christian people as an entity, as a thing, as a political thing, so that Christendom expands as, well, first with Charlemagne, is expanding the borders of his empire. That was based, though, on the myth of Rome. Because the myth of Rome, which emerged and developed in the context of Caesar Augustus and the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and I would love to get into all this, but I don't have the time, portrayed Rome as a divinely sanctioned eternal empire. This was God's will. Jupiter had established it, decreed it. We see it in Virgil's Aeneid, which Caesar Augustus, had commissioned Virgil to write as a new history of Rome. And its empire would have no end. And his virgin right to be bounded only by the heavens and the seas. And it was to bring peace to the world. Now, we're going to talk a lot about that. But what happened was, in the course of the 4th century, the Roman Empire became Christian, converted to Christianity. So by the end of the 4th century, by 391, Christianity is the only legal religion of Rome. Now, there's a distinction, though, to make between the Roman Empire becoming Christian and the Christian Empire. That's this transition we get from the 4th century through up then to the end of the 8th century when we get to Charlemagne. And this concept of Christendom, because the Pope crowns Charlemagne Roman Emperor. It's a big issue. I'm not going to go into all of it before. It's not Holy Roman Emperor. That's a later issue, which I'll get to in a second. It's Roman Emperor. So there's a continuation of Rome. The idea of Rome hangs over all of this course. Not just this part of it. It continues. It's the imperial ideal, the imperial dream of world empire, world peace, ruling the world as a divinely sanctioned mission. And it's really fun to talk about because we talk about when does Rome fall? Does it fall in 476 with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in the West? But 476, there's still the emperor in the East. When does the Eastern Roman Emperor fall? 1453. But in 1453, we already have the Holy Roman Emperor. But before that, we have Charlemagne as the emperor that was seen as the continuation of the Roman Emperor. Now, Charlemagne's empire was extensive. He's often seen as the father of Europe. But it wasn't as extensive as the Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire, which is more commonly known nowadays anyway, in textbooks and things, as the Byzantine Empire, which is simply the Eastern Roman Empire. It continued until 1543. But the Holy Roman Empire starts really with Otto I in 962, when the Pope crowns Otto Holy Roman Emperor. So for the first time, we have that designation, and that's an important distinction. Charlemagne is Roman Emperor. Otto I is Holy Roman Emperor, but it's still seen as the continuation of the Roman Empire. And that continues. When was the last Holy Roman Emperor? In 1804, I think it was, when Napoleon got rid of him. And we'll get to that. But yet, in 1894, Roman Empire, there was still a pretense to continuation, because there was a monarch in Europe in 1804 that claimed direct descent and continuation from the Eastern Roman Empire. That was the Tsar of Russia. Tsar, C-Z-A-R, is just this pronunciation, basically, of the classical pronunciation of Caesar. C-A-E-S-A-R in classical Latin was pronounced Kaiser. So the Tsar is just a form of Kaiser. When did the Tsar fall? 1917, with the Russian Revolution, which we'll be talking about. But in 1917, not only does the Tsar fall, we have another empire claiming descent from the Holy Roman Empire that kind of fell apart too, namely the Second Reich. The Second German Empire, Second German Reich. Reich in German means empire. That was under Bismarck after the unification in 1871 of Germany. Under Bismarck, we have the German Reich, and it's the Second German Empire. The First German Empire was seen to have started with, basically, we can go back to Otto in some ways, but certainly with Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century. The First Deutsche Reich. Well, shortly after the fall of the Second German Reich under Bismarck in World War I and the fall of the Tsar, there grew up a new movement in Germany that was to establish the Third German Empire, the Third Reich, under Hitler, with the pretense of all the trappings of Rome and the Roman Empire. What is this? Heil Hitler. That is Hail Caesar. That is the imperial salute. How did we used to say in this country the Pledge of Allegiance? We used to say the Pledge of Allegiance as this. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Yes, the imperial salute is how we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And when the Nazis started using the imperial salute, we thought, oops, we can't do that. That's when we said, nope, we're going to do it differently. So we have to say it with our hand over our heart. That's how we say the Pledge of Allegiance from now on. The symbol of Roman Empire in Rome was the eagle. Symbol of the German Empire is a double eagle. So what's the symbol of America? The eagle. It's all imperial. Imperial ideology, understanding, myth. So the myth of Rome remains, even as it's transformed into this myth of Christendom, which is the Christian Empire. And that is very important for understanding then the development of what I will be referring to as the myth of the nation state. Given that, then, the problem was, who ruled Christendom? If it's the Christian Empire, who rules it? Is it the Pope or is it the Emperor? Now, theoretically, all the political leaders were underneath the Emperor. So if you were king of France, you were theoretically under the Emperor. That didn't really play out either. 16th century, the king of France and the Emperor are fighting constantly. So it's like, okay, fine. There was this sense of, if I'm king of France, I'm ruled directly for God. The emperor was like, I rule directly for God. King of France, I rule directly for God. King of England, I rule directly for God. So there's this sense that the lay power was the primary one. And that's important because the whole development of Christianity, when does it become legal in Rome? It's under the Emperor Constantine. And Constantine calls for the Council of Nicaea, which sets Christian doctrine, or at least parts of Christian doctrine, fundamental parts of Christian doctrine. That was done by the Emperor. Charlemagne is in charge of the church, quote unquote. There is one term I hate, or phrase that I hate and hope no one will use, even though you won't fail if you use it. But it is so warping the understanding, even though it's so prevalent everywhere, and that is the conflict between church and state, or church and state. We have a separation of church and state in the United States. No, we don't, but I'll get back to that in a second. And often even good medievalists write about the conflict of church and state. I thought there was no conflict between church and state. There was conflict between clerical, ecclesiastical power and lay political power. And they're one and the same. And who is on top, who has superiority, was debated. And so the whole concept of the Middle Ages is this age of faith where everybody just followed whatever the Pope said is so completely false. The idea that the church and the state are distinct, because they wouldn't understand it. In the Middle Ages on into the 16th century, they would not understand it. What do you mean the church and the state? They're the same thing. The question was, do we have a church state or do we have a state church? That was kind of the issue. And I could go all into the theory of that, but that's a very important thing to grasp. The conflict and debate was between ecclesiastical power and lay power. And the basis for that distinction was the sacrament of ordination. The sacrament of ordination was what enabled a priest to effect the sacraments, because no emperor could effect the sacraments. And what were the sacraments? There were 7 of them. Baptism, confirmation, confession, penance, marriage, holy orders, and last rites. I'm leaving one out. Anyway, they are the means of grace of the Eucharist. Of course, the Eucharist. I gotta forget the Eucharist. Baptism and the Eucharist were the 2 most important ones. They're the means of grace. So if you don't partake of the sacraments, you can't get to heaven. Now, I have up there on the slide salvation at stake, because that's what made it all work. And what made that work? Belief. Belief. For there was such a thing as heaven and hell, and that you could end up in one place or the other. That was real. It wasn't belief in the Pope. Henry IV, the Emperor Henry IV in the 11th century, was excommunicated by Pope Gregory VII, and Henry could care less. He didn't believe that had any effect and any power. The problem was, in theory, if you were excommunicate, you were not a legitimate Christian prince, and so therefore you couldn't be the emperor. So there was imperial vacancy, and other German princes saw, this is an opportunity. And so Henry had to capitulate, and then went and humbled himself before Gregory, and Gregory readmitted him to in good standing with the church. And then he went on and ended up, Henry went his merry way, and a little bit later was excommunicated again, and he didn't care. He believed in heaven and hell, but he didn't believe that excommunication of whom he considered to be a false pope had any effect whatsoever. That was the issue. There were debates, fights throughout. What do we do about it? How do we understand it? And without that kind of understanding of people believe this, and we can say, well, I don't believe that anymore. Fine, you're welcome not to. But we won't understand the period unless we realize that these people believed in heaven and hell. And there were some that maybe didn't. When we get to Machiavelli in the 16th century, some of his writings seem to indicate that he wasn't all that sure about heaven and hell, because he said basically, before Billy Joel, he'd rather go to the hell with the fun people than to heaven with the boring people. I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. Only the good die young, said Billy Joel. But Machiavelli had basically said the same thing. So there are issues there, but in general, the system worked, and it was based on belief. That's what kept it all together. The sacraments, including the Eucharist, were so important. And we'll be seeing some of those differences when we see the breaking up of Christendom shortly in this lecture. That was at issues. And then we get to the problem of Reformed and Reformation. What is the distinction? It had been more traditionally to talk about late medieval Reform and then early modern Reformation. That the Reformation in the 16th century ushered in modernity with some little help from the Renaissance, and was different from the Middle Ages, which were backwards. And even if we can recognize reform movements in the later Middle Ages, or in some ways throughout the Middle Ages, that's categorically different from what happened in the 16th century. My argument, and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which you see up there on the slide, and that's my term that I coined in my book, Lutheran Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. It's to say that if we look at the sources, that distinction between Reform and Reformation is not what the sources say. The sources have Reformation. They felt it as an urgency, as a need, as something that must come about. Because the later Middle Ages was an age of crisis. Now, crisis is an overused term. We say we're always in a state of crisis. We have our freshman crisis in college, then we have our sophomore crisis, then our junior, then our senior crisis, then we have our middle age crisis, which I don't think I've ever had, so I don't really know what that means. But we're always seem to be in a state of crisis. It's overused. I'm talking about political crises. Increasingly there's talking of a constitutional crisis. Have we had one yet? No. Have we ever had one? Yes. The country has had one crisis. A lot of problems, a lot of serious problems and issues, but only one crisis, the Civil War. Now, we may get there again, but we're not quite there yet. Almost, we're close, but we're not quite there yet. But we're getting into a period of crisis. And a crisis is when all the structures that we had always assumed were the basis for reality, for how the world worked, all of a sudden don't work anymore. It's not just problems, it's not even very severe problems and challenges. It is a crisis because we don't even know what to do about them, how to fix them, because the whole basis for our understanding of how things work isn't working. So what do? That's the problem. And the late Middle Ages was one of crisis. And if we see there on the slide, I hope there, the late medieval crisis, we have papal princely conflict. As I mentioned, Henry the Fourth and Gregory the Seventh. There's conflict there. There's conflict between princes and popes, and between popes and emperors all along. But in the early 14th century, there are a couple of outbreaks of papal princely conflict as never before. First, between the King of France, Philip IV, and Pope Boniface VIII. And again, this is a fantastic story, but to make it very short, essentially, Philip IV sent troops to capture Boniface to bring him back to France to try him for heresy. But again, to make a long story short, they weren't successful. Townspeople came this because Boniface wasn't in Rome at the time; he was in his family estates in Anagni. Townspeople came to defend him from the invading French troops. Sent him on his way, but he was very sure. He was basically mugged. Something like, you don't do that. You don't do that to the Pope. The poet Dante, the Italian poet Dante, of Divine Comedy fame and all that, he hated Boniface's guts. So much so that in his not Purgatorio, but Inferno, in his treatment of hell in his Divine Comedy, he put Boniface in like the 6th or 7th level of hell. That's what he thought of Boniface VIII. But he was shocked by Philip IV's attack, mugging of the Pope. You don't do that because of the office, not because of the individual. The individual could be a piece of crap and worthless, but the office is important. That concept of office goes back actually to the Donatists with Augustine. Are the popes holy? No, the office of the papacy is holy. Popes are not. That was standard medieval understanding. Could you have bad popes? Of course. We're bad popes. But the office is, it's like the office of the presidency. You may hate the president, but you don't disrespect the office. I don't know if that makes sense. But think about it in those terms. There's a dignity to the office. Now, even that is kind of falling by the wayside. But there used to be a dignity to the office. That even if you couldn't stand the individual there, the office was respected. Same thing with the papacy. And that caused a shock. What Philip IV did to the Pope was like, how could you do that, even though you hate him? That caused just further conflicts, and all it was over power and authority and who had the right to say what and determine what, should go on in France, and get into all kinds of issues there. And then shortly thereafter, another Pope, John the 22nd, Pope John the 22nd, had a major conflict with Emperor Louis of Bavaria. And it's been estimated that John the 22nd spent 2/3 of his income on troops to fight Louis of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor. Back and forth, back and forth. This too was a shock. What do we do? So all of a sudden, what had been almost a tradition from very early on within Christendom of papal princely conflict that went on, and most people didn't really care that much, really, when it came down to it. Obviously, with Henry and Gregory VII, for example, other German princes were like, "Yeah, we can benefit from this," but in general, it didn't have that big of an effect. But all of a sudden, it did have an effect, and it was widely known. It was a shock. It was making news, so to speak, and that was just part of the problem that people were facing, because in 1314, right in between the conflict between Philip IV and Boniface VIII, and John the 22nd and Louis of Bavaria, just as that was kind of beginning, famine hit Northern Europe. Not so much the South, not so much Italy, but the famine. And the famine was like nothing before. There have been periods of famine, there have been periods of hunger, but not to that extent. People were dying of starvation. Even there are accounts of cannibalism. Now, I can't say that cannibalism actually took place, but you can imagine it. What do you do if, your spouse dies of starvation and you don't have much time left and your children could go at any moment? What do you do when there's no food? It's a horrible decision to have to make. That's what makes your mind just twist, like, how can this be? How sick is this? That's what happens with the famine. That lasted from approximately 1314 to approximately 1322. Then, of course, there's poverty. There's poverty. The majority of people in Christendom were poor. There are various levels of the peasantry, and in the 14th century, actually in the 13th century, we have the emergence of bankers. We have the emergence of free cities that were independent of the feudal overlords. There's a lot of growth and development, but still, overall, the majority of people were poor, especially contrast. The lower nobility in the later Middle Ages too had a problem because they were suffering. The higher nobility is like, okay, not a problem. Lower nobility started to be squeezed, and they passed that along to the peasants. And the peasants then get upset about it. We start having a series of peasant revolts. All the peasant revolts on until the 16th century, as I'll be talking about with the so-called German Peasants' War, were not about we want to be free. They weren't enslaved. I mean, there were serfs. We'll talk about slavery later, but there were serfs. Um, but those were the minority of the peasantry. The peasantry was a class. All of Europe was divided up into three orders, as it was called. And it's not really right to say class because it has different connotations to it, but three groups or classes of people. There was the nobility, or the order of those who fought. There was the clergy, or those who prayed, and then there was the peasants, or those who worked. So if you weren't part of the clergy, you were either part of the nobility or part of the peasantry, even though nobles could become clerics and peasants could become clerics at times. So that was the issue. And so legally, everybody who was not part of the nobility or the clergy was classified as a peasant, even though there became very wealthy peasants. And at times, especially in the later Middle Ages and on to the 16th century, peasants who were far more wealthy than the lower nobility. But that is that conflict, that gap between the haves and the have-nots, especially when those who have less than they would like start passing that along and squeezing those below them. The peasant revolts would simply give us our traditional rights as peasants. We're happy to be peasants. Just let us live. I could talk a lot more about that, but that's will also be important as we get into the 17th century and the 18th century and the revolutions, because that structure of the three orders in French, ordo, which is a Latin term, and it means several different things in Latin too, but those three orders in French are the estates. We'll talk about the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate when we get to the French Revolution. And that was what was then finally overturned in the French Revolution. So there's conflict, there's poverty, there's war, because what happens in the 1330s? England and France continue their fighting. Now, in general, we talk about the beginnings of what has been referred to as the Hundred Years' War, as beginning in about 1336, the Battle of Crécy, basically. But France and England have been fighting off and on since the 12th century. English king had in his title, also King of France. It's a mess. It was a mess. So this 100 Years' War was not also continuous fighting for 100 years. It went on and off, and back and forth. Never really settled, but we refer to it as the 100 Years' War. And it's not pleasant. War is never pleasant, especially when you're in a kind of a constant state of war. I don't think I need to emphasize that. So we have all of these problems, and then in mid-century, in 1347, a huge crisis hit, namely the Black Death, or the Plague. It's not called the Black Plague. It's the Black Death or the Plague. There are three types of plague: bubonic, septicemic, and the pneumonic. For this course, that's not all that issue, but the plague does come back. The plague was huge. We talk about it as, it hit its peak in 1349 in Europe, came from the east, from trading ports into Genoa and Venice, and then spread and got to England by 1349, and people were dying. It's been estimated that approximately approximately 1/3 at least of the population died. In some places, it was as high as 80%. In Florence, it's been estimated that approximately 80% of the population died from the plague. We considered COVID to be bad. What percentage of the population died of COVID? Nothing like a third to a half of the population. Just imagine for a moment the impact of that. So we have death, we have famine, death. We have plague, death. We have war, death. We have poverty. Those are the four horses of the apocalypse. That's from the book of Revelation. War, famine, poverty, death. And we see a real upsurge in apocalyptic expectation. The end of the world must be coming. We see the signs of the times. How clear can it be? Nothing like this has ever happened before. And then what happens? The church splits. There's a split election in 1378, and we have two popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. And Europe divides politically. We don't know what to do about it. That is a real problem. It's called the Great Schism. And it was an issue of, because if you're the Pope in Rome, what do you think of the Pope in Avignon? You think that person is a schismatic, and a schismatic is even worse than a heretic. You excommunicate him. Now, the theory was if a ruler is excommunicated, everyone underneath that ruler is excommunicated, or at least cannot have access to the sacraments under the ban. So, in the Roman Pope's eyes, excommunicate the Pope in Avignon. Nobody who follows the Pope in Avignon can have the sacraments. And that basically means if you die without the sacraments, you're going to hell. But if you're the Pope in Avignon, what do you think? You think it's the Roman Pope who's the problem. We have to get rid of the Roman Pope. And so we excommunicate the Roman Pope. And then everybody who follows the Roman Pope is excommunicated. In short, everybody in Europe, everybody within Christendom was excommunicated by one of the other popes. Now, if you followed one of the popes, you believe that pope to be the true pope. It doesn't really matter that a schismatic excommunicated you. But for the common person, how do you know? A couple of councils tried to, the first council in 1409, tried to settle the schism, because we have to get something, figure out what to do about this. It just made things worse. They elected a new pope, and they had three popes, actually, and the third pope got enough political support to make a claim as well. So they got together with a council again in 1414 with a new theory. It's called conciliarism, appeal to the council. And they proclaimed the council, the general council of the church, as the representative body of the entire church, as the ultimate authority within the church. Not the Pope, not the Emperor, but the council. And, popes and princes and emperors were all part of the council too. The Council of Constance in 1414 was called basically with the help of Emperor Sigismund at the time, who made it all possible. So this is a widespread movement. Now, there was not a lot of other opportunities or solutions. So what the council did, they ended the schism, they deposed all popes, they made a number of reform decrees, they also burned at the stake John Huss, but that's kind of another issue. And they proclaimed another decree called Frequens, that there had to be another council in 5 years when Constance was done, and then after that council would be done in 7 years, and then when that council was done in 10 years, and then every 10 years there was to be a general council of the church to make sure things were going fine, where the Pope would be the CEO of the council as the representative body of the whole. Now, it worked for a while. The Council of Constance ended in 1418, so in 1423, the Council of Pisa met, or Pavia met, and things were fine. They closed up shop in 1324. 7 years later, Council of Basel met in 1431. That has a whole story behind it too. And by that time, the popes were gaining back power from the council. Council was a big undertaking and everything else. So the popes were picking away at this movement called conciliarism, this political theory of conciliarism with the council as the highest authority within the Christendom. And under Eugenius the Fourth at Basel, and then he moved the council to Florence and Ferrara. he was able to effectively to deal with that problem. And the Council of Basel / Florence Ferrara ends in 1439. So it should have been a council in 1449. Nope. 1459. Nope. 1469. Nope. The next council wasn't until 1512. And that was important because conciliarism was dead. Already in 1462, Pope Pius II condemned conciliarism, condemned the call to a council. Only a pope can call a council. That's a problem. Now, that's going to be important. Why was there opposition to it? Why did the European leaders say, wait a minute? Think about it. The council is a representative body. No prince is going to want that. There was a representative body in the empire. There's the emperor, and then there's the Reichstag, the imperial legislature. Did the emperor consider himself to be the CEO of the empire, that underneath the Reichstag? Hell no. In England, there's the parliament. Did the king feel that he was below and underneath the parliament? Absolutely not. In France, there was the Estates Generales. All these are representative bodies, but the monarchs were like, we are in charge of them. They serve us. We're not going to support the theory of conciliarism. And the Pope is just, in some ways, another prince. We talk about papal monarchy arising in the 13th century, acting just as another prince. In so many ways, that was the case. So it died. The same issue back in the early 14th century. One of the people associated with Louis of Bavaria, who was with Louis at his court, fighting against John the 22nd, was this Italian scholar named Marsilius of Padua, and he wrote the most radical political treatise in the Middle Ages called the Defensor of the Peace, Defensor Pacis, in which he argued that the papacy should be abolished. Now, Marsilius of Padua was a devout Christian. He knew that in his heart that Christianity was the only true religion. The clergy was needed. The priesthood was necessary for the state. But the papacy, so we should get rid of it. That too. I mean, Louis loved hearing that because he was fighting the Pope. But when you get down to it, it's like, what? What do you mean? That would mean that we should get rid of any monarch? Because that was basically, no, it wasn't basically Marsilius's argument. It gets more complex than that, but it didn't really catch on until later, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that was a problem with conciliarism. So there's this ongoing attempt to call for reformation. That's what it was all about. Call for reformation. I have there the observant movement. The observant movement was one monastic movement that we should have to bring about reform. And there was a treatise written, the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund in 1439, that is very explicit and calls for reformation and says it will happen, it will come, a reformer is coming. He'll be named Frederick of the New Land. He will impose reformation from above. We have to follow him. Now, I know this is getting already too much time with what's coming up, which I have to cover, so we'll see how we go. I'm rushing through this now. But that was the context of the urgency and expectation. And that was the context that Martin Luther, who was a German Augustinian observant hermit and monk, not monk, that's a technical thing. He was a friar, or different, technically different from monks, but by that time Martin referred to himself as a monk, so it's okay. But I'll go into that distinction a lot more in my high and late medieval course. But Luther had some of these same views, and we have to understand the beginnings of the 16th century Reformation as coming out of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Martin Luther, in so many ways, is the culmination of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. He didn't really know a lot of the traditions of his own order. He didn't know a lot of the theological traditions. He claimed that he knew it all, but he didn't. And in terms of the theory of the papacy, his order, the Augustinian hermits, were the theorists for the Pope. And Martin had what was essentially basically kind of a heretical view of the Pope. I mean, he called himself a papist, and he loved the Pope. Um, and even, when he was gotten himself kind of in trouble with his theses against indulgences, he wrote to the Pope and said, "I will recognize, your voice as the voice of Christ. Tell me what you think." Anyway, so these were these sense of urgency. And the princes were involved too. The princes' reformation up there, in terms of the reformation of the later Middle Ages, is really related to the observant movement, because the observant monks felt, hermits, mendicants to be even more technical, were the ones who felt that they were the last hope for the church. They were bringing about the Reformation, and the princes would then establish the Reformation within their territories by establishing observant monastic communities, because the princes were in charge of the spiritual as well as the physical well-being of their subjects. That was the mentality. We have to provide for our people. And yet, Reformation, true Reformation, never really came. It failed. That's what is up there. The failed Reformation is the Reformation was not simply reform, it was calls for reformation in head and members. That was the phrase that was used over and over again. Reformation in head, the Pope, and members, everybody else. Now, against that context, we get to the 16th century. And I have up here the patterns of Reformation. Now, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages can be seen as a pattern of Reformation. But here I'm talking about the Reformation of the 16th century and thereafter. And I have there Luther's Reformation, the Radical Reformation, the Communal Reformation, the Reformation of the Refugees, the English Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. I'll try to go through this as quickly as I possibly can. Luther's Reformation is not simply Luther. Luther was not the only one to complain about indulgences. There's all kinds of other problems involved. And Frederick the Wise protected Luther. Luther was condemned at the Reichstag in Augsburg. And one of the readings you'll have for, I think, next week is the Confession of Augsburg in 1530. We'll talk about the origins of Protestantism at the time. I'll be dealing with that next week, and the second lecture for next week. But Frederick really protected Luther. And a number of German princes also sided with Luther. So all of a sudden we have this opposition between individual princes within the empire, which is a confederation of states and princes and everything, and then those who are loyal to the Pope and to Rome. And the emperor was loyal to the Pope and the Rome. It ended up, as we'll be talking about next week, in civil war. But there is this conflict. And Luther, one of the things he did too, was he wrote a catechism. There had not been a catechism before. There had been catechetical works, and catechism just means catechesis is just instruction. What do Christians need to know? And this was a new development. Luther himself considered his catechism to be one of his most important works, because it was based on memorizing answers to questions. It was, here's the question, you answer it. Now, I can talk a lot about that. The Confession of Augsburg, I'll talk more about next week. It was a document, and it's not a confession in terms of, I'm so sorry, we confess that we're wrong. It is a confession of, this is where we stand. This is what we confess the truth to be. And that was at 1530 at Augsburg. The Reichstag rejected the princes and cities who were supporting the Luther's position, and that was to lead to civil war, as it did. All the while that Luther started kind of, let's say, taking off the lid of the boiling pot, other movements started developing. We have the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation is very problematic because it's not one thing. There are very diverse groups that fit into the Radical Reformation. Radical meaning because theologically they were off. The Baptist tradition comes from the Radical Reformation. I can talk a lot about that. Kind of calls for revolution come from the Radical Reformation. We have the German Peasants' War of 1525, which we can consider part of the Radical Reformation, and that's something that Luther and Charles V, the emperor, and everybody else could agree upon, that the peasants cannot revolt. And Luther even says, in his treatise against the murderous revolting hordes of peasants, slay and kill the murderous peasants. You will merit your salvation by the amount of peasant blood you spill. That's not one of Luther's most well received statements. I mean, Luther, I could spend a whole time talking about Luther, uh, quite a guy. Um, but he was so upset because they were also appealing to him as the basis for their revolt. And he was like, absolutely not. That's not what I was meaning in any way, shape, or form. It was put down. Later, there was another, it's called the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. In the German city of Munster, where they tried to institute the New Jerusalem on earth, and based on polygamy, multiple wives, and that was also put down everywhere. So that is a different than radical Reformation. But they also the pacifist movement comes out of the radical Reformation. Uh, um, the oh gosh, the Amish up north in Indiana, but they're still all around, and so and also in the east. Um, they come out of the radical Reformation. Pacifists. What kept them all together, so to speak, was that none of them had a political basis. And I talk about the Kingdom of Munster, that was an attempt, didn't work. But they did not have the political support, so they were outside of the political structures of society. The communal Reformation then is something a little bit different. That's when we have, okay, what do we really do? Once we get rid of the following the Pope, what do you do? How do you organize yourself? How do you organize society? And this was based on the commune, which was the city, the community. And Luther writes, how to organize the common chest, basically the community's finances to support for pastors. Well, I mean, the church was the biggest landholder in Europe. It had structures, it had institutions all in place, and when you then say we're not going to follow you anymore, we're going to go our own way, what do? There's a huge gap, a gap in services, a gap in institutions. No, it also was a big financial boon. If you declare independence from Rome, you can seize church lands. There are lands now. That's what Henry VIII did. And on we go. We can see these things. But this is some of the struggle that's going on here and there and everywhere. I'm trying to get through this again as much as I can. But that was the communal Reformation was kind of from below. It's also has been referred to as the Reformation of the common man. The communal Reformation, how do we put it all together? Whereas Luther's Reformation is very much top down. Uh, Radical Reformation has no political basis whatsoever. The communal Reformation was from the bottom up, so to speak, and then we get to what's called the Reformation of the refugees, which is for this course probably the most important. Even though I'm running out of time, I'll come back to this maybe a little bit later next week. Reformation of the refugees refers to John Calvin and Calvinism. John Calvin was French. He was a French lawyer. He studied classics, or what's called the humanities, in classics and classical scholars. First publication was a classical commentary on Seneca's De on Mercy. Working in Paris, but then after an event in 1534 called the Affair of the Placards, he has to flee because Francis I, the King of France, starts cracking down on Protestants. And this, too, is a fascinating story, which we'll get to. So Calvin flees, first goes to Basel, then he ends up in Geneva. I'll just make a very long story short. He was there in 1539. He was kicked out again, but then asked to come back in 1541. Said, well, I will if you establish and accept my ecclesiastical ordinances. They did. He stayed in Geneva, and Geneva became the bastion of Calvin's movement. Very kind of different from Luther. But Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion became perhaps the most important book to come out of the Reformation. It went through numerous editions from 1536 until 1559 and grew exponentially in that period. The problem with Calvin is he's so misunderstood, as a lot of the reformers are. Calvin was French, and his whole focus was on France. He had to flee. That's what's called the Reformation of the refugees. He had to flee to Geneva. But he always was concerned for France. People were fleeing France to escape the persecution of Francis I. They would often come to Geneva. They often spread, and you have Calvinists then ended up being in England, and we start talking about international Calvinism because it's spread throughout Europe. It's a doctrine of divine sovereignty and predestination. That's what we always hear about. We can talk a lot about that. But the point is that there's a distinction between what Calvin argued and then what Calvinism became. Anytime we start hearing an ism, that leads to warping what the ism, the original founder, or what the ism is based upon. You can love Calvin, you can hate Calvin, but he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant, even if you completely disagree with him. But he was not what Calvinism was like. We'll see too later on. We're talking about Marx. Supposedly, Marx said at one point when he gave a report about some of his followers and what they were saying and what they were doing out there, and he says, and the name of Marxism, and he says, "Well, thank God I'm not a Marxist." That's the difference between the kind of the founder of something, the originator, the person with the insight and brilliance, and then people who try to follow it and apply it. But we'll get there as well. But the whole point of Calvin's marks of the church, which were for discipline, no, preaching the gospel, correct preaching, correct administration of the sacraments, which were then two, baptism and the Eucharist, and then he had a third, discipline. Geneva was a theocracy. The attitude of law, divine predestination, but you never know. I mean, Calvin knew his Augustine very, very well. And Augustine, too, argued for predestination, as did Luther, because Paul talks about predestination in Romans. You have to deal with it somehow. Calvin, though, it was the way to deal with persecution. If you believe that you are in God's hands, you can get through almost anything. That's kind of the point. And Calvin would say, we can also look back on our lives and see God's work in our lives, saving us all the way along. What we can't do is look forward. Now, with the morality issue, Calvin was good enough, as I said, I'm an Augustinian. He knew you can say you're going to go to hell. Now, if you're a heretic, yes. Under Calvin, Geneva burned Michael Servetus in 1555 as a heretic. Protestant Geneva under Calvin. Calvin said, we shouldn't burn him. We should just behead him. But the small council said, nope, we're going to do what we've always done with heretics. We're going to burn them. And they did. And that will come back next week as well. So it's a very complex situation when all of a sudden you have this doctrine of predestination then turned around to a Calvinistic sense of hard work leads to salvation and predestination. Because there are, just like there are marks of the true church, there are marks of being among the elect. And that is hard work, discipline. So the more moral you are, the more obvious it is that you're part of the elect. That wasn't Calvin's position. And that led to what was called the Protestant work ethic. This idea of, cleanliness is next to godliness. You have to work hard. And it actually turned Calvin on his head. Later Calvinism turned Calvin on its head. And Calvin would have been pulling his hair out if he had been still around. He's like, that's absolutely not what I'm arguing. That's actually works righteousness is what you're doing. Now, to get into all those issues and details and explain that development and how it all came about and the context would be take too long at this point. But it's very much important to make that distinction. That Calvin is not the same as Calvinism, and Calvin's positions aren't the same as those that were espoused and claimed him as their origins. And Calvinism took on a whole other life. I mean, my doctoral advisor was Dutch. He was a Calvinist. He was an ordained Calvinist pastor in the Netherlands before he then became, as he became a historian. He was at Harvard and the Divinity School and at Tübingen before he went to Arizona in the history department. And he has a great book on Luther, and he has a lot of different books. And he has a couple books on Calvin, but the Calvin book he really wanted to write the basic thesis of it, because I know we've talked about it, was that Calvinism, he said, is a beautiful religion under the cross. But when it becomes the established religion politically, he says, as it did in the Netherlands, it becomes diabolical. Now, that was said by a Dutch Calvinist. That's what we're getting at and looking at. And that spread of that Calvinism, a perversion of Calvin's own positions, is what had the most effect. Just as what spread under the name of Augustine of Hippo back in the 5th century as being, I guess, was often a perversion of Augustine's real position. Same thing with Luther. Same thing with Calvin. The isms we have to always be wary of as it all develops, because they have almost in some ways the biggest impact. It's the misunderstandings, the misuse of these great minds and insightful people. So then we have the English Reformation. I'll talk a little bit more, go into that in more detail next week as well. But that is also a different pattern of Reformation, because that was starts with Henry VIII and proclaiming himself as the head of the church, which is fantastic, because it's not just because he wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine. It's actually very complex. It was all about succession and having a male heir. He did want to divorce Catherine, and the Pope said no. The Pope said no, not because of any moral stance, but because the Pope had already, a previous Pope had already proclaimed Henry's marriage to Catherine valid, and so the Pope would have to go against a previous Pope's pronouncement. And then number one, number two, when Henry sent his delegation to Rome to seek an annulment, Charles V's troops had sacked Rome, and the Pope was in hiding in Castello San Angelo. Why did they sack Rome? This is the Holy Roman Emperor. Why did his troops sack Rome and make the Pope flee for his life? Because the Pope had supported the King of France in his wars against Charles. That's the political machinations of these people. It's not, oh, Pope. That's what was going on. And Charles was the niece of Catherine, and the whole point was to join the Habsburg. Charles V was a Habsburg. The Habsburg and the Tudor houses. So the Spain, because Charles V was also King of Spain, Spain and the Empire would then join with England, so that the heir of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon would be heir to basically all of Europe. That was this grand plan. And now Henry said, Catherine has only given me a girl. I want to get rid of her. And Charles is like, absolutely not. That's not for my family. That goes on. Didn't work. We all know this. Well, we don't. Maybe not all know the story. No, I'll talk a little bit more about it next week when we get there. But then Henry does have then another girl with Anne Boleyn, whom he married after Catherine. And it wasn't until later that he finally had a son, Edward. Henry dies in 1546. No, 1547. And Edward comes to the throne. He was a weakling. He dies in 1553. So Henry's first child, Mary Tudor, the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne. She's known as Bloody Mary, because what did she do? She returned England to obedience to the Pope. That was a problem. And she's called Bloody Mary because she captured a lot of the Protestant leaders and put them to death. So there's tensions. Edward was basically raised as a Calvinist. And so we have Henry, whose positions were basically the same as Rome's, and Catholic, but not politically so. Edward moves the English church very much towards a Calvinistic view. Mary brings it back to Catholic, and then Mary dies in 1555. No, 1558, excuse me, 1558. And Elizabeth comes to the throne, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And she was one of the most foremost formidable monarchs of the 16th century. and we have what's called the Elizabethan settlement. She has to deal with it, and she then comes up with the solution that is not as Catholic as Mary's or as her father Henry's, but not as Calvinistic as Edward's. So that's what's called a compromise, and didn't really necessarily satisfy all that many people, but especially didn't satisfy the really Calvinistic side, or the Presbyterian side of the English church that had been developing under Edward. It was then taking place in Scotland, who had John Knox became the reformer of Scotland, who had studied with Calvin for a little while in Geneva, considered Geneva to be the bastion of piety, and he wanted to affect that in Scotland. And so, anyway, Presbyterian just means priest in Latin, but it's more pastor and stuff. So the Calvinistic faction thought Elizabeth hadn't gone far enough, and they thought we need still to purify the Church of England. We need to purify the Church, and they became known as the Puritans. We'll talk more about them next week. Then we have the Catholic Reformation. Catholics were kind of slow in getting on board in some ways. In many ways, the Catholic Reformation was the continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages in terms of approaches and adaptations. But then it also was an element of really, now we have to counter these Protestants, these new groups that are popping up. How do we go about doing so? And they put their house in order. The Council of Trent was one, and then a new religious order came about called the Jesuits, which set on a missionary plan of education. So that's the problem. We need to educate. Just like Luther had said, we need to educate with the catechism. We have the development of the Roman catechism as a counter to the Luther's catechism. And all of a sudden, catechisms spring up all over the place. So all these different patterns of Reformation are leading to this disintegration of the overarching myth that we are one geopolitical entity that is Christendom. No, we are then individual principalities within the empire, even though there's still an emperor, but as I'll talk next lecture about, or the next week in any case, after 1555, Charles V abdicates and quits because there was acknowledgement of two religious confessions, Lutheran or evangelical, and then Catholic. It was up to the prince of the territory to determine. He failed. He was the last medieval emperor. So we have division there. We have France based on the state, England based on the state and the monarch, Spain based on then, after 1555, when Charles abdicates, on his son Philip II. And so we have all of these individual monarchs and developing states claiming supreme authority for the church and for the political body. Christendom was crumbling. And we'll talk about how that all works out next week, because there was a lot more that was going on in terms of the ending of Christendom, besides just the Reformation, even though that was central. Now we have here from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. And what do we find? We find, and I'll be saying much more about this next week in the lectures, and then as the basis for continuing on into the 17th and 18th centuries, an increasing lack of toleration and the growth of authoritarianism. So often the Reformation is seen as, or is portrayed as, the beginning of individual freedom. That's absolutely what it was not. Absolutely what it was not. Quite the opposite. It was the growth of authority cracking down on individual belief. There's much more leeway in 1400 and 1300 and 1200 in the church to believe various things. There weren't a lot of number of burnings of heretics. There weren't a lot. The whole witch craze was basically a 16th, 17th century development. Because if you're a prince And if you choose to follow, Luther, or if you choose to follow Calvin, and I'll get back to that, you want to make sure that everybody in your territory does so, because that's the best right way. These are matters of belief, and salvation is at stake. And so it's your responsibility to make sure that everyone in your territory has the right, correct belief. You've gone to war for this right. So what? They can go to hell. I don't care. My people aren't going to. So structures were put in place, catechisms put in place, where state bureaucracy is growing. I'll be talking about that again more next week. But it's a lack of toleration. I mentioned Michael Servetus being burned at the stake in Geneva in 1555. There was an individual there, a humanist, and I'll talk more about humanism next week too, a humanist named Sebastian Castellio, who in response to Servetus being burned said, "To burn a man is not to defend a doctrine. It is simply to burn a man." That attitude, though, was in the overwhelming minority. Heresy was a cancer that would infect your soul and send you to hell. We put people to death today. We have the death penalty. Not every state, but a number of states still have the death penalty. What would you die for? Would you die for your beliefs? And the other question is, what would you kill for? Would you kill for your beliefs? I'm not advocating either. But unless we can understand what's behind it, we won't understand the period, not just the Middle Ages. We won't understand early modern Europe, and really not too much modern Europe, and then it starts to change later on. And we'll get to that change in time in this course. But for this first period of this course, and not just these early lectures on the background, so to speak, to the 1648 starting point, that's what it's about. You would willing to die for your beliefs and to kill for your beliefs in various ways and reasons. In some ways, it was simply you kill because a heretic, because they can infect your people. You're willing to go to war for your beliefs. We have to try to understand that, to understand the dynamics that was going on at the time, and then to see how that slowly changes. So there's a growth in the lack of toleration and a growth in authoritarianism. And then we have, by the end of the 16th century or so, centralized monarchies in England, France, and Spain. We have the empire, which is a confederation. The emperor is an elected official, as is the pope. We have the Italian city-states. There's no such Italian unification until the 19th century, which we'll be talking about. So it's like decentralized, and the empire is decentralized, though, with still though an emperor, and then centralized monarchies in England, France, and Spain. I'll be talking next week too about the Dutch and the Dutch Republic as it's coming about. And we see again, I have up here that from a church state to a state churches, we have that shift from kind of medieval Christendom view, where the Pope certainly was a church state, the Emperor was kind of a state church, but over everything. But now we have individual national churches. And we have emerging a very, very new world than what had been 100 years previous. And in that 100 years, too, a new world had been discovered. And the European conception of reality was kind of blown apart. That's what we'll talk about next week. And surprise, surprise, I'm shocked with myself. I'm quote unquote more or less on time. And I'm just very sorry I had to abbreviate so much and skip over so much territory and material that is so fantastic. So anyway, we'll leave it there. I'll probably won't sleep very well tonight, but so be it. and I'll get over it. If you have any questions, just ask. But I think I hope I've provided some of the essential background together with the lectures next week to then understand where we're going in the course from that point on. We pick up with the textbook and go from there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong button. Here we go. Bye-bye.